Welcome to Channel AMEC, your insight to the Australian visa system. Good day everyone, my name is Carl Young, your online YouTube visa consultant. Are you interested about migrating to Australia? Why don't you consider to subscribe to my channel and turn on a little bell on the side so once we have all the updates and news, you'll be the first one to getting all the insights. Now today's video is all about tax. Obviously I'm not a tax agent, I'm not an accountant at all, but I've received so many inquiries and emails basically asking about how does the tax work. Now first of all, I do not hold the license or registration to actually provide that kind of professional advice. You should really find an Australian registered accountant to get that advice. But what I'm going to do today is basically go into the Australian Taxation Office and find out what the tax residence definition is. Now what does that mean? Because a lot of people get confused between Australian resident and tax resident. It's actually totally different. So if you hold a permanent residency in Australia, well, are you a tax resident? You're probably not if you're not in Australia. So it's actually a legal definition by two parts of major complicated law in Australia. So today this video will help you to find out and define what Australian tax resident is all about. This is not about visa. You can be holding a student visa or working holiday visa or perhaps a work visa and you are an Australian tax resident. Now let's jump in there and have a look. Okay, now you may want to Google this. You will find this page as well. I wanted to provide the most updated information for you. All you need to do is you go to Google and you punch in ATO space tax residency or tax resident, whichever you wanted to spell it. You should be able to find yourself into this web page here, issued by the Australian Taxation Office. Now it may be lengthy and there is a residency status information download, which I have already done, and it basically copy all the information that is on this page, but it just looked better with the image. So why don't we utilize that, and you may want to download that by yourself too. So this is the actual format of the actual information there. So again, I found this is basically redundant. I mean, if you already have information here, why would you do this one? Perhaps they want to print it out and give it out to people, but we're in a digital world. We got to save the planet by less utilizing paper. Anyway, let's go in and have a look as the government of Australia has already provided. As you can see on the top right corner, it says tax time 2022. So this information is the most updating information. I've done one long time ago, but I think it's time to get some update, especially we're in a new financial year. So there was a talk about changing of the definition or update of the definition of a tax resident, but it looks like it's still be the same, and this information is much simplified and easier to understand compared to the either going to be 2021-20. Back then I've actually done one video previously, but anyway, this is the most updated one. You don't want to watch that one because that's outdated anyway. Okay, so tax residency, for tax purposes, if you pay or learn what you can claim to understand your tax situation, you need to know if you're a tax resident for tax purpose. So again, you may be an Australian citizen, but you may not be a tax resident. So this is the key. Only if you are a tax resident, then you should be taxed by the Australian Taxation Office. Okay, so residency of a tax person may be different from residency status. For other purposes, you may be a resident for tax purposes even if you are not an Australian citizen or permanent resident. That's exactly what I just said. So let's go and jump in there and have a look. So this is a major information that I want to share with you, which is public, that you can actually download by themselves. So I don't think I'm going to go any wrong as I'm not a registered tax agent or accountant to actually provide a tax advice. But we are here only to share what the definition is all about of tax residency of Australia. So residency and tax. As an individual, you'll be fit into one of the following 3 categories. So what are the 3 categories? One is Australian resident for tax purpose, foreign residents, or temporary residents. Okay, so let's have a look. If you're satisfied residency test, you are an Australian resident for tax purpose. Now, this means that you have declared all of your worldwide income, even if you have already paid tax on it overseas. A foreign income tax offset is generally available to reduce Australian tax on the same income. So that's good. So if you're an Australian tax resident, and for example, you're in Australia and you happen to be a very successful YouTuber and you make money from USA, for example, all right, YouTube pay you through USA. Well, Google will have a office in Australia to pay you in Australian dollars. Well, that's not a good example, but for example, you do something online shopping, you have some retail online shop, so people purchase and things like that, and you make money elsewhere, not in Australia. So as long as you have paid those the taxes over there, then what Australia do is they calculate the differences. If Australia has a higher tax, then they will add on additional tax on top of that. So okay, now second one is foreign resident. If you do not satisfy any residency test, you're a foreign resident. As a foreign resident, you have no tax-free threshold and do not pay any Medicare levy. So what does that mean? So if you're a foreign resident and you have income in Australia, then there's no tax-free threshold. That means the first cent you make, you need to pay tax. There is no tax-free threshold. If you're a tax resident, I think the threshold is around 220,000 per annum. So you don't have that threshold. You must still declare any income derived in Australia, include any capital gain on taxable Australian property in Australian tax returns. So that means if you have held a property and then 2-3 years ago and you decided it's a good time to sell it, so you get that capital gain and that will be taxed, okay, as an income. Okay, if you have higher education loan program or trade support loan debt, you are required to declare worldwide income, lodge and non-lodgement. Now, what does that mean? Now, basically, it's only the Australian citizen is able to access to higher education loan program. So why are they talking about foreign resident here? Well, you can be an Australian citizen, but you are not in Australia. That's what they're trying to say here. Okay, so again, your status of your visa or your passport does not equate to the tax laws residency definition. That's exactly what they're trying to say. So you may study higher education in Australia, for example, in University QUT or Queensland. Okay, and then once you graduated, you got higher. I don't know, to Silicon Valley, for example, San Francisco. Great, you made some good money, but obviously you then will be a foreign resident. But if you have any income in Australia, then you'll be taxed, and that's exactly what they mean. And if you have any debt which is connected to your previous studies, then the debts will require to be paid off. All right, now third one is temporary resident. You'll be a temporary resident if you hold a temporary visa. Another, you and your spouse is Australian resident within the meaning of Social Security. So that means you hold a student visa, work visa, working holiday visa, and so on and so forth. Anything not permanent residency, okay, or citizen, okay. As a temporary resident, you only need to declare income derived in Australia, plus any income earned from employment or services performed overseas for a short period while you are a temporary resident. So what does that mean? That means if you hold a working visa coming to Australia, not Australian permanent resident or not an Australian citizen yet, but you got employed by the Australian employer, all you need to pay is paying for that statutory's equated tax. Now, obviously, while you're in Australia, so for example, you trying to do some buy some shares and you sold some share and make some gains in US shares, then obviously that at that time you are a temporary resident in Australia and you earn those money through shares, then you're required to pay for that capital gain, I believe. Other foreign income or capital gain do not have to be declared. There are separate rules of working how they make it. So anyway, that means if you're earning something else out there, doesn't really care about that. Now let's move on. So the key here is the residency test. Why? Because here is basically finding out whether or not you are an Australian tax resident. Okay, so the residency test, there are 4 tests used to determine if you are an Australian resident for tax purpose. You'll be an Australian resident if you meet any one of these tests. So there are 4. As long as you meet one, then you're there. You're an Australian tax resident. Okay, you can use the online tool. We're gonna jump into that online tool later of this video to have a little test on that one. So resides test. Under this test, you are a resident of Australia if you're residing in Australia according to the ordinary meaning of reside. That means you live in Australia. Okay, your permanent address is in Australia. Okay, some of the factors also be used to determine residency tests include physical presence, intended purpose of family, business, employment ties. So they're basically looking into your situation, whether or not you declare or your permanent resident domicile is in Australia. That's the resides test. And domicile test, it's a little bit different, but a little bit confusing, but let's go through that. Under this test, you're a resident of Australia if your domicile is in Australia. So that means you have a house, you got home in Australia. Unless a commissioner is satisfied your permanent place is outside Australia, the domicile is a place considered to be your permanent home by law. Now, what does that difference between this one? Now, this is more of testing on about, I would say, family, where you're born. For example, you may be a domicile by origin or by choice. Maybe you get married and things like that. So I personally, I believe these 2 tests is very, very similar. Now the question is why they are doing these 2, because there will be some circumstances for different family will have different way and different combination of, well, it can be a marriage, it can be a civil partnership. They never married but they got kids. How do you calculate that? What about the same-sex marriages and all that? So it's different type of situation over the past. So they decide these kind of 2 tests. For me, it's kind of similar. It's just asking your permanent place of living. All right, the third one is pretty straightforward. 183-day test. You'll be a resident under this test if you spend over half a year in Australia. So again, it will be pretty easy for an international student, although they are temporary resident, right? If we go back up here, first of all, we define who you are. You got to be an Australian resident and you're in Australia, then of course you get taxed, and you're foreign or you're temporary. So if you're international student holding student visa and come to Australia and study for half a year, stay there for 183 days, then obviously you meet the tax residency test. So you'll be a resident under this test if you spend half a year, unless you establish your usual place in the job outside of Australia, which is going to be hard. It's going to be hard to test that one. Okay, and the fourth one is Commonwealth Superannuation Fund test. This test only applies for certain Australian government employees. Okay, so that's for the public servants who are eligible for contributors public sector superannuation scheme. So that basically meant if you are an expat, for example, they've been sent out by Australian government to work overseas in different other countries. For example, all the diplomats, okay, they get paid by Australian government, and obviously they will have that superannuation fund going into their superannuation. So then they will satisfy this residency test as well. So they obviously they need these people to pay Australian tax, although you are not in Australia, and your permanent living places and domicile tests will be probably overseas as well, but then you'll still be counted as the Australian tax resident. So let's go into examples. So let me move this. You probably can read this. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. For example, example 1, Emily teaching in Japan. So English teacher. So Emily leaves in Australia to work in Japan as a teacher in English. She has 1-year contract, after which she planned to tour China and other part of Asia before return back to Australia to work. During her time in Japan, she lived with a family who treated her as their own. She rented her own properties. She rents out her properties in Australia. So she has her property, her home, her house or apartment in Australia, but she'd rent it out, so she's not living there. Emily is single, her parents live interstate, and her brother has moved to France. Outcome: why is Emily considered Australian resident? Even though Emily is residing in Japan under the domicile test, her domicile is in Australia. A resident who has always lived in Australia will generally retain a domicile here when they are absent overseas, unless they choose to permanently migrate to another country. Her permanent place of job remains in Australia. So what does this mean? This test basically, so this is a very good example of domicile test, is that you can categorize, although you're in Japan for 12 months, but that's temporarily. Your permanent domicile place is still going to be Australia, because you got to return back to Australia. You don't have a long-term visa. You have not applied to migrate to Japan. You're only traveling to Japan as an English teacher, and then after that you're going to go to China for touring. So obviously she will still deem to be the resident of Australia for tax purpose. Okay, now the second example, Browan. Browan, an extended job overseas. Now, so previously Emily had a short-term job of 1 year in Japan. Now let's look at this example here. Browan is Australian resident. Okay, so she is obviously a citizen of Australia. Has received a job offer or work overseas for 3 years. Now that's going to be longer than 1 year. Then what we're going to see here is, with the period extended of another 3 years, so 3 by 3, so 6 years, Browan, her husband and 3 children decide to make the move. They retain their property in Australia and they intend to return one day. Well, one day can be, 6 years later. The house will be rented out during their absence. Browan is uncertain whether she will extend the option to stay another 3 years, depending on how family like the life. Well, obviously they will rent a house with accommodation allowed provide under her contract. So her outcome: the residency test is not satisfied because the length of Browan's physical absence from Australia and surrounding circumstances, that such as the home overseas with family, renting out, are not considered with residing in Australia, even though she has retained family home in Australia. The domicile test, so obviously the first resides test is not satisfied, so because she's long-term out of Australia. And the second test, the domicile test, is not satisfied as well because the permanent place of job is outside Australia due to the length. So again, they're looking at the length, how long you have been or you will be out of Australia, committed to spend overseas, establish her home overseas. The fact that she will not selling the home in Australia, although relevant, is not persuasive enough to overcome the finding of the basis of the factor. It's arguable that she has abandoned her home in Australia. So again, this is a very good example. So it's really, we're going back here looking in the length that you are spending overseas compared to with between the short term and the long term. So 1 year and 3 year, that is the differences there. Okay, now going down here is, it does have people who hold dual citizenship. So dual resident, you're considered to be dual resident if you're a resident of Australia for domestic income tax law purpose and resident of another country for purpose of another country's tax law, where Australia has a double tax treaty. Now you need to check that out. All you need to do is you go to Google and punch in double tax treaty Australia and space whichever the country that you want to put in, and you can find out they have done this treaty back in the 90s with a foreign country. A treaty is break tiebreaker test will usually determine which country has the right to tax Australian foreign source income. Working holiday maker, if you come to Australia working holiday visa under 417 or 462, you have fixed tax rates regardless of your residency status. So that's different ways to actually provide an incentive for people to come to Australia and work in those regional and agricultural or those outback agricultural or perhaps mining sector. Now let's go into the actual test form. Let's have a look. Now you may find this as well on the Australian Taxation Office. It's actually on the actual there's a link in this here, online tool. If you click on the online tool, it's also over in here as well. Where's the online tool? Resites, tests, and the online tool somewhere. Anyway, you click that, you get into this page. So what we're gonna do is we have got to run some samples here. So here, I'm not generally gonna go into working holiday because they have, as we read, they have a fixed taxation law there. So are you a working holiday man? No. Okay. Are you migrating or settling in Australia? Yes. Okay. And then we submit that. Are you a resident? So you are a resident of Australia for tax purposes. Oh, well, that's pretty straightforward. Now if we go back, whoops, what have I done? Okay. We go back there, and then if we go on yes and you submit, that's a tax resident for working holiday, and you can see all those details there. So let's go back there again. If we go no, are you migrating or settling in Australia? No. Are you an Australian returning to live in Australia? So obviously if you're Australian returning back to Australia, then you are a tax resident. That's pretty, I know that. That's pretty straightforward. If you know, have you stayed or do you intend to stay in Australia for 6 months or more? Yes. Let's have a look. Select purpose. Okay. Let's have a look. Let's go for employment. Have you stayed or do you intend to stay in particular place for 6 months or more? Yes. Selection. Let's go staying with or owning your buying home. For example, do you have a spouse? Yes. Currently living with you. Where do you hold your majority of assets? Well, let's go Australia. As you can see, those tests is actually testing your domicile and your permanent places of living. Are you a member of any clubs or church community? No. Okay, let's go. All right. Oh, are you a resident? You're a resident of Texas. Okay, that's great. Let's go back again. And let's jump in there and go no. Are you returning to live in Australia? No. Do you stay or do you intend to stay in more than 6 months? No. Do you have social community tie in Australia? No. Let's go yes. See what happens. Result, you're a foreign resident. Again, you can see that. Although you're an Australian citizen, now you become a foreign resident of Australian tax purpose. That means you do not hold a tax-free threshold. Okay, if we go back here again, one more step. If you have no social or economic ties, well, economic tie can be anything, business or property. We are unable to determine your residency due to unusual nature of your situation. Wow. Did I just break the system? Interesting. So anyway, this is a very good tool that you can utilize for you to actually determine whether or not you're gonna be, you are deemed to be a tax resident for Australian taxation purpose. Anyway, should you have more questions, query, more than welcome to leave a comment right down below, and I'll see you next video. Goodbye.